I want to start our final unit where we left off in Unit 5 with this idea that perhaps we have been asking the wrong questions about schooling and moving towards equity in schooling, at least when it comes to the policy level. And we ended Unit 5 by looking and talking about the Perry Preschool Project and how by changing the measurements and the questions that we are asking and investigating, we see a very different outcome for those who participated in the Perry Preschool Project. And we, in fact, see um, greater equity of results. We, in fact, see a perhaps life changing program that wouldn't otherwise be captured in the typical ways that we think about whether educational programs and policies are working. But in this unit, Unit 6, I want to expand this idea of have we been asking the wrong questions even further, not only to think about what measurements and what ideas are we including when we think about educational success and equity and justice at the policy level, but by thinking about and by looking at what communities themselves want from education. And that perhaps that is the question that we should be asking if we are committed to, in the United States, democratic, equitable, equal education and educational opportunities. Now, to be very clear, when I say that we're going to be looking at and thinking about what communities themselves want from education, I'm not talking about any community. I'm talking about those communities who have been marginalized in education in the United States, those who have been the targets of assimilative policies, federal policies, those who are often have been constructed historically as the quote problem in education. So specifically, thinking about communities of color, Black communities, Latinx communities, Native American communities, Asian American communities, but also other communities and other identity groups within American schooling, such as queer students, neurodiverse students, and also thinking about groups such as teachers, who, while they are not marginalized in education, they are often marginalized by policies or in the policymaking process. So we're going to look at a number of different groups, or you already have if you've done the readings, right? You've already looked at several different examples of how communities organize and advocate for their vision of educational equity and justice, how communities organize and advocate for their desires of an educational system that serves their needs, their children, their hopes and dreams. So we're going to talk a little bit about those examples and what they might tell us about education and educational change. And we're going to use two words specifically: self-determination and community sovereignty. It's actually three words, but self-determination and sovereignty to frame this conversation. While we can use these words to talk about any marginalized community and their hopes, or what we value in education, I want to be really clear that these two ideas, sovereignty and self-determination, while we can talk about them broadly and generally in relation to any marginalized community in the United States, to multiple communities of color, that these words have very different meanings for Native Americans, for Indigenous Americans, for American Indians, because sovereignty and self-determination are in fact treaty rights for Native nations in the United States, for Native nations that have entered into governmental treaties, government to government treaties between Native nations and the United States of America. And so what do we mean by sovereignty and self-determination? Again, they are treaty rights for Native people and for Native communities and nations, but broadly, more broadly, sovereignty and self-determination are about the right of a people, a community, particularly those who are marginalized and or positioned as having less power in a governmental system or in a national system, having the right to determine what they want for their own lives, for their own communities, for their own institutions, for policies that affect them, that if we were speaking poetically, that they are in charge of their own destiny rather than being at the mercy of a government or a group of policymakers or power brokers who is not of the community. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about these two photos that I have here. These are both from Milwaukee in the late 60s, early 70s, when Native communities and activists here in Milwaukee occupied the at the time abandoned Coast Guard station. So in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of reclamation of federal land going on, or activist reclamation of federal land going on, most famously when Alcatraz was occupied by activists and families and young people who were part of the American Indian movement to reclaim Alcatraz, which was federal land for Native people. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was a treaty, a U.S. governmental treaty, that stipulated that any unoccupied federal lands, after a certain amount of time, I don't have all those details in front of me, but that unoccupied federal lands would revert. Ownership isn't the right word, but I'm going to use that because I'm blanking on a better word. But the ownership or possession of the lands or control of the lands would revert to the Native nations that held them before they were seized by the U.S. federal government. So in the case of Alcatraz, there was a multi-nation community of American Indians, of Native Americans who occupied Alcatraz to reclaim it. And in doing so, it became a site of something called a survival school, which was in many ways an antidote to the kind of schooling that the Bureau of Indian Affairs and U.S. federal government was providing for Native Americans around the United States. It was in some ways a desire to create a kind of pan Indian, not utopia, because that's not quite the right word, kind of like ownership, but you understand the gist, right? To sort of imagine a better world and create it there at Alcatraz. Something similar happened here in Milwaukee when the Coast Guard building was occupied. And so the picture on the left is a picture from that occupation, as is the picture on the right. And so what we know today as the Indian Community School here in Milwaukee was in many ways formally birthed during the occupation of the Coast Guard building here in Milwaukee. There had been a group of mothers who had been engaging in education with young Native children prior to the occupation. But when the Coast Guard building was occupied, these mothers and other activists and teachers in Milwaukee's Native communities began a survival school here in the Coast Guard station that eventually went on to become the Indian Community School. As I said, survival schools, if you haven't seen the documentary, by the way, Warrior Women, I should have included it in the resources for this week. It's really powerful. It's available from our libraries, and I highly recommend it. But so survival schools were an act of sovereignty. They were an act of self-determination. They were an act of Native people and communities saying, we have had enough of the kind of education that's been forced on us, as far back as Indian boarding schools, but continuing into today. And we are going to reimagine and reenact a different kind of education, one that will sustain our culture, our communities, our nations, our treaties, our languages, our bonds, our families, our knowledge, our history, a sustaining education where we decide what the curriculum is, where we decide what we want of our students, where we are engaged in educational self-determination. And it is within our sovereignty rights to do this. I share this example because these ideas of sovereignty and self-determination are in many ways what I'm asking you to consider this week. What does it look like when communities claim their sovereignty and their right to self-determination over their own education or their children's education? And we are indebted to Native nations and communities and activists who remind us regularly of how these rights are codified in treaties between Native nations and our federal government here in the United States. So let's talk about a couple of the movements, social movements, organizing movements that have been enactments and what we can learn from them. So here you have a couple different pictures. On the bottom left, you have a picture of a Mississippi Freedom School. Top right, you have a picture of Septima Clark in a Sea Island Citizenship School. And the bottom right, you have a picture of Freedom University, which is talked about as a modern day freedom school in Georgia for undocumented college students to have access to education. What we see across these organizing and social movements is something really similar to the Indian survival schools. This idea or this understanding that schools provided by the government have failed us, either because we don't have access to them, bottom right, undocumented students, right, not having access to post-secondary education, or because schools have failed us. The picture in the top right is both rooted in an understanding of the failure of schools. So Septima Clark was engaged in a lot of basic literacy practices with voting age adults in order to re-enfranchise voters, Black voters in the South, and also educate them about the rights and responsibilities as U.S. citizens. Many of these adults had not had access to schooling. So schooling was both may have failed and also had been limited in access. And in the bottom left, the Freedom School movement, which took place in Mississippi, which involved university students largely from the North, white university students largely from the North, engaging in culturally relevant and historically relevant and contextually relevant pedagogies with young people in Mississippi in the summers. They set up shop in community centers and churches and elsewhere to engage in a more relevant and meaningful and powerful education. And the freedom schools were ultimately an intersection of allies and activists across the civil rights movement, across geography and across race. All of these we see in all three instances, communities that have been marginalized and excluded from officially sanctioned schooling. When they reclaim and reorganize educational spaces, we see a granting of access. We see an emphasis on fundamental skills. And we see an emphasis on what we would call today culturally sustaining or culturally relevant practices. And across all of them, these practices, these skills, these pedagogies, these curricula, these levels of access are understood as being fundamental to broader social movements, to the civil rights movement, to the movement for immigration reform, to the movement for voting rights, right? Specifically in the civil rights movement. We see that education is a necessary precursor and lever to the power and participation and efficacy of those social movements. We can also talk about and look at youth organizing. So you looked at the examples in Unit 6 of the LA blowouts, a series of protests led by Los Angeles youth, Chicano youth in Los Angeles, in the same era as the civil rights movement, demanding a change to educational policy and practice in Los Angeles public schools. While the students, in some respects, were not ultimately successful, the Los Angeles School Board did not meet all of their demands, they paved the way for continued work around ethnic studies, and again, around culturally relevant and affirming and empowering education. Their mantle, in many ways, is taken up decades later by youth in places such as Tucson, where youth were engaged in the Mexican American Studies program, which was ultimately banned or eventually banned by the legislature, and youth organized. The Chicano youth who participated in the Mexican American Studies program organized to push back against the legislative ban against ethnic studies in Arizona. Again, for the same reasons, right? Around being understanding that they are more powerful when they are empowered by content that is relevant and by pedagogy that is relevant and affirming and humanizing. And in the bottom left, we have an image from here in Milwaukee, the Leaders Igniting Transformation, which you may be aware of their role in bringing about change in MPS's disciplinary policies. MPS had faced longtime charges from the Office of Civil Rights for racially disproportionate disciplinary and suspension rates. And youth here in Milwaukee, Leaders Igniting Transformation, predominantly youth of color in Milwaukee's public schools, engaged in activism and organizing to change Milwaukee's disciplinary policies, again, towards education that is affirming, towards education that is humanizing, towards education that is not punitive, towards education that is culturally relevant. We've seen, for example, a move towards restorative justice, and while it's very imperfectly enacted here in Milwaukee, this is part of what youth advocated for. So when youth are engaged in organizing, if I'm just going to flip back slides again, right here we see ideas of education for liberation and for social change rooted in basic skills, but also political curriculum, socially relevant, culturally relevant curriculum, and expanding access to people of color and to those who would not otherwise be granted access to official educational spaces, and creating new educational spaces. Here we see youth organizing within official state-sanctioned educational spaces to bring about that kind of change. The change that they see as relevant and needed, that again focuses on issues of ethnic studies, restorative justice, pedagogical change, curricular change. Now, teacher organizing is a bit different, right? Teachers are not necessarily a marginalized community or group of people here in the US or even within educational spaces, right? Teachers are the backbone, and yet teachers are often marginalized by state policy. And so recently, in the past decade, right, there have been waves of teacher activism on the left. A Red for Ed march. I think this one is from Arizona based on the palm trees, but we saw them in Arizona and West Virginia and Indiana, and all sorts of marches and strikes for better educational policies, often demanding better funding, more special education teachers, more power over curriculum, where teachers are advocating for changes that benefit students, arguing that what benefits students benefits teachers. The top right picture is here from Wisconsin, for those of you that participated in the Act 10 protests in 2011. The Act 10 protests were against the legislation that was ultimately passed by Governor Walker and a Republican legislature that in many ways dismantled public sector unions here in Wisconsin. Now, those two issues may not seem directly relevant or pertinent to communities of color or immigrant communities or other communities of students and families that are marginalized in U.S. school systems. And yet, as we read about, teachers and teachers unions have been deeply involved over time, not always, but in many cases, in advocating for equity and for aligning themselves with the demands of communities and students. We can also look at how local advocacy and policy change happens here in Wisconsin with the example of Act 31. So you looked at a couple videos connected to Act 31. But this grew out of challenges over treaty rights. So on the bottom left, you have the Tribble brothers, who were, I believe they were members of the Lac Courte Nation in northern Wisconsin, who allowed themselves, or purposely became, a test case related to the enforcement of treaty rights around fishing, around off-reservation fishing and hunting here in Wisconsin. There, at the time in the 80s, the 1980s, tremendous conflict, is often called in Wisconsin the Walleye Wars, right? Over the exercising of treaty rights for Wisconsinites who are native, who are members of tribal nations, having the right to fish and hunt on ceded lands that were no longer controlled by native communities but had once been native lands. In treaties with the state government and the U.S. government, rights were guaranteed to continue using those lands. In any case, when the Tribble brothers and legal teams challenged and pushed for the honoring of these treaty rights, there was tremendous backlash. And there was violence, there was hate speech there from white Wisconsinites towards native Wisconsinites and the exercising of those treaty rights. And it was from this conflict over the exercising and the honoring of treaty rights that Act 31 was born. Act 31 is the statute that, among other things, requires that classrooms in Wisconsin and teacher education programs in Wisconsin teach about the federally recognized tribal nations in Wisconsin, as well as their treaty rights and sovereignty rights as nations here in Wisconsin. Act 31 also calls for teaching that honors or that reflects the experiences of Wisconsin's different ethnic groups, specifically African American and Latinx history and cultures in Wisconsin schools. So Act 31 is a policy that came out of specific legal strategies, but then also activism and in response to hate, right, against violence and hate speech, and as a way of enacting an education in Wisconsin, understanding that it is important that schools teach about treaty rights in order to prevent the kind of backlash that was seen during the Walleye Wars. That if Wisconsin schools are teaching about the native nations, their treaties and their rights, other Wisconsin citizens will better understand native nations and their treaty rights and their rights to sovereignty in Wisconsin. That in turn affects other teaching about communities of color here in Wisconsin. We can connect this to struggles today over curriculum, where we started at the beginning of the semester, with conversations around critical race theory in schools. And this idea this posing of CRT as a curricular bogeyman. What we see in all of these examples of organizing are communities who have been the targets of assimilative and oppressive policies in US educational systems, calling for honest curriculum, relevant curriculum, self-determination in curriculum, curriculum that humanizes and that empowers. And communities understand that education that does this is empowering and liberating, and maybe can lead towards social change. And that is precisely why anti-racist teaching, culturally relevant teaching, all these things are being subsumed under an idea of critical race theory in those who are opposed to it. This is why it's targeted. Because it is, if education is going to be a tool of liberation and social change, it begins here. And so communities, predominantly white communities, but not only, but predominantly white communities, white parents, white activists, are pushing back. Because when our curriculum, when our practices, when our pedagogy responds to the demands for sovereignty and self-determination of communities of color, that challenges the status quo, not only of schooling, but of society. And so this struggle over CRT or not CRT, struggle over ethnic studies, not ethnic studies, over disciplinary policy, over how Native Americans are taught about in Wisconsin schools. All of these are struggles over education as a site of social change.